Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick,
And I'm Tony.
and we start our newest book from an old friend of ours. And by that, I mean it was kind of one of the first books that Tony ever gave me was from J.P. Moreland. And today we're going to start our book, Scientism and Secularism, Learning to Respond to a Dangerous Ideology. And if some of this stuff sounds kind of familiar, it's because we covered it in our last book on miracles about David Hume. And we kind of broached the subject a bit on scientism. And so figured maybe dig into that a little bit more. And if you go to the YouTube page on Cave to the Cross and check out some of the new comment sections on David Hume, on some of the videos there, you'll see that scientism still lives on and it still reigns supreme. So we
Alive and
figured
well.
we'd poke the bear a little bit more here and respond to some of that. And so you might be saying, well, what scientism? Isn't science good? Well, scientism is something that our author will define here shortly and then get into what makes it a dangerous ideology. So by now you'll have the book, but we'll probably just be going through kind of the introduction, the forward introduction here, and then next episode we'll dive into the first chapter. All right, so Dan Ellinger begins the forward by saying that our children are growing up in a post-Christian culture in which the public often views people of faith as irrelevant or even in some cases extremists, right? So, if you tell others to love one another as God loves you, or to do good to your enemies, or maybe we should be the peacemakers and things, definitely extremist cases, and we need to stop that from happening. And of course, all the other bits of extremism that gets levied at all sorts of religious people, even if they should take it or not. But the world desperately needs people of faith who can contribute to public life and enhance the public conversation, he says. So how do we raise up a generation of Daniels to be the voices of faith in a cultural Babylon? Standing up for what you believe in, even when everyone else is bowing down. And so he asked that question at the start.
Right. So how indeed can we do this? How can we raise a generation of Daniels? And as you will recall, in Daniel, he stood against his particular cultural indoctrination, I think, right? They were definitely trying to indoctrinate Daniel. They changed his name. They made him speak Babylonian. They tried to, they trained him in all the ways of the Chaldeans, right? The Babylonians. Of course, he said he stopped when it came to his dietary issues, right? I'm not going to eat that crap, right? For whatever reason, we're not exactly sure, right? Perhaps it was sacrifice to idols, perhaps it was, pork, who knows, right? Anyway, he said, just give me vegetables. And so he stood against that, and the Lord rewarded him for that, right? Gave him 10 times more wisdom than all the rest of the folks who he was dealing with. So how do we raise up folks who are willing to stand against that type of indoctrination, cultural saturation, and that sort of thing? Well, Egler here tells us, he quotes Phil Yancey in the book, What's So Amazing About Grace. He says that Yancey developed a word picture that provides a powerful reminder of the approach that must be taken. So what is it? So let's just kind of read from Yancey's book here to see if we can get a feel for exactly what he's talking about. So Yancey tells us, a phrase used by both Peter and Paul has become one of my favorite images from the New Testament. We are to administer or, quote, dispense God's grace, says the two apostles. The image brings to mind one of the old-fashioned atomizers women used to use before perfume spray technology. You squeeze a rubber tube, right? And droplets of perfume come shooting out of the fine holes at the other end. A few drops suffice for a whole body, right? So you squirt it and get a few on your body, and that's good. Now you're good to go. A few pumps, he says, changes the atmosphere in the whole room. That is how grace, he tells us, should work. It should not convert the entire world or an entire society, but does enrich the atmosphere, right? In other words, it doesn't convert everybody, but it does make a change in terms of the atmosphere, is what he's giving.
Right. And so Yancey goes on to say, now I worry that the prevailing image of Christians has changed from that of a perfume atomizer to a different spray apparatus, the kind used by insect exterminators. There's a roach, pump, spray, pump, spray, pump, spray. There's a spot of evil, pump, spray, pump, spray, pump, spray. Some Christians I know have taken the task of moral exterminators for the evil-infested society around them. Now, Egler tells us that the challenge is to uncompromisingly share absolute truth while not coming across as bug spray. He says that in this book, J.P. Moreland articulates a way of friendly engagement with the prevailing world of scientism. And so I have some issues with this idea. I don't think that the dispense of grace is this atomizer that's occurring here. I understand his word picture. I get where he's coming from. And I believe he uses the term winsome, which always makes me wince when anyone uses winsome. But I'll take the charitable route here and say, so if you remember back to our book Tactics by Greg Koukl, I wouldn't quite call that winsome, but I would say that there were elements in there that allowed a conversation to occur. And one of the things that Koukl was big on was to kind of tamper down the rage that may come up on both sides. And so I think that's the intended issue here. And I'm not quite sure that I fully undertake Egler's point here. I think winsomeness may be too soft, and the dispensing of grace by God shouldn't be an atomizer, but it should upend the world. It should turn the world upside down. It should conquer Rome without the sword. And so I don't know if you can do that with a perfume spray. But let me give the charitable interpretation here and say that we're not to go in hacking and slashing, but we're to take every thought captive. And so I think that's something to consider as we approach this book, because if you've heard interviews from Moreland before, he is very even-keeled. He is very thoughtful. And to say that he's a Bronx boxer would be incorrect. And so I think that attitude comes out in this book as well.
Yeah. Egler goes on to say that scientism says that the hard sciences alone, this is what scientism says, the hard sciences alone have the intellectual authority to give us knowledge of reality. So the hard sciences alone,
Right.
only the hard sciences is what he's getting at. Everything else, especially ethics, theology, and philosophy, is at least, according to scientism, based on private emotions, blind faith, or cultural upbringing. And so he tells us that Moreland provides a particularly persuasive argument that counters the popular perception that science can explain everything. In reality, he says there are many things that science cannot explain. Moreland concludes with a very helpful compilation of strategies for integrating issues between faith and science. And so Egler tells us that he concurs with and even applauds Moreland's analysis of the danger posed by scientism and the very practical guidelines that Moreland gives us for responding to that danger in a winsome, there's your word, but convincing way.
Yeah. I'll take the convincing, and I'll do it nicely. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's the Roadhouse effect. Be nice until you can't be nice. And then, well, taking then the introduction by Moreland, he kind of recounts his kind of coming to faith and his background, and I thought this was really interesting because I didn't know this about him. I didn't know his start, and so this was quite surprising. So if you're a fan of Moreland, this is a nice jaunt down his memory lane here. He talks about that he grew up in the 1950s in a working class neighborhood outside of Kansas City, Missouri. His father died when he was in second grade, and he was raised largely by his mother, though she did not marry again until his seventh grade year. One thing was contrast throughout his childhood, a love for science. It goes back as far as he can remember. He was a veritable glutton for all things scientific. On his fifth birthday, he got a microscope and spent hours on looking at slides. He had a rock and moth and insect and leaf collection, and he consumed a series of books for his age on different branches of science. He talks about even going so far as to being surprised that he didn't blow up the house with his experiments, which
Right. Yeah, he did get a chemistry set. You know, I remember about that same age, and I think he's a little older than I am, but I think maybe every kid got a chemistry set back in the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah.
Because I remember getting my parents buying me a chemistry set. And yeah, it was fun, at least for a while. So I discovered a basketball. But
they made those illegal and made illegal the lawn darts, but they still gave us, for my generation, creepy crawler machines and metal hot plates. I just think back,
wow.
You would not be able to have those. In fact, I think eBay makes it illegal to sell things like that still. So yeah, I believe that there were even atomic kits that still had pieces of radium in it.
Wow. Wow.
So
Yeah.
So we've come a long way, and maybe there's a reason why scientism has taken over is because we haven't been very scientific in our youth.
Yeah, so those chemistry sets were metal boxes, and then they had a bunch of little bottles of various things there, chemicals, I guess. So anyway, yeah, so Moreland goes on to say that in his junior year, his science fair project was submitted to the Greater Kansas City Science Fair. So this is junior year in high school now. He's moved on. And he and a friend had won second prize in physics. And then his senior year in high school, he won first prize in chemistry and was offered and accepted a sizable fellowship to major in chemistry at the University of Missouri. So he went to Mizzou, right?
Yeah.
He says in college, his interest developed into physical chemistry, and he was captured by it, and that became he became one of the three top chemistry majors at the university. His last semester at Mizzou, he said he was offered a full ride to the University of Colorado to do research in nuclear chemistry. And looking back, he realized that he excelled at science not only because he had a natural talent for it, but also because I truly loved it. And so what he's doing here, at least part of what he's doing here, is helping us to see that he loves science. He thinks science is a good thing, and he's not against science,
Right.
because you might look at the title of his book and say, well, this guy is against science. What kind of guy is this, right?
Mhm.
Well, this guy loves science, right? And he spent a considerable amount of his time in his early years in doing science. And so he loves science. So, we can put those kind of worries aside with regard to his hatred of science, because that's not the case.
Yeah. And so I'm reading this and I'm going, well, I know there's got to be a turn somewhere because he's not chemist J.P. Moreland, he's philosopher J.P. Moreland. And
Yeah.
so where does this come about? Well, here's the turn. But something happened to him in November of 1968, his junior year, that would alter his life and his plans for the rest of his life. He was led to Christ by Campus Crusade for Christ staff worker after weeks of meeting with him to ask questions about the evidence for Christianity. So he immediately joined the Jesus movement and became, and by God's grace continues to be, a radical follower of the Lord Jesus. So it would have been a wonderful calling to be a Christian chemist. And science is a notable and strategic vocation, but a conversion, a whole new world of ideas open to him. He learned about history and biblical studies, theology, and most importantly, apologetics and philosophy. This is the J.P. Moreland that I know right here.
There you go, right?
So he said that he sensed his own calling and was to turn down the chemistry fellowship and join the staff at Campus Crusade, which he did and stayed on staff for 10 years.
Wow. So he had a fellowship to go to school in Colorado, right?
Yeah.
And turned it down as a result of his conversion to Christianity.
Right.
So that's really interesting here.
Yeah, and again, at the height of nuclear power and the Cold War and everything else going on, so he turned down a sizable career there for Christ.
Yeah, yeah. He says that with regard to these philosophy and theology and that sort of thing, he says his love for these newfound subjects led him to get a HM, right, a Master's of Theology, in theology at Dallas Seminary, an MA in philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, and a PhD in philosophy at the University of Southern California. He says his love for science influenced his areas of specialization, namely the philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, and metaphysics, which of course is the study of the nature of reality.
Right. So he's bridging the two sciences here. He's our theory of knowledge, right? So he's been a part of the hard sciences for pretty much his entire life. He loves it. He advocates for it. He sees the value of it, and it's how we know things. But he also knows we know things through non-scientific, hard science ways. And so he's bridging the gap here by saying that he's kind of a master in two areas. And so his pedigree is coming to the front here. Well, he says, sadly, during the process of his various studies, he constantly bumped into something dark, hideous, and I dare say evil. Oh, man, what is that? Well, it was a philosophical notion of scientism, roughly the view that the hard sciences alone have the intellectual authority to give us knowledge of reality. Everything else, especially ethics, theology, and philosophy, is, at least according to scientism, based on private emotions, blind faith, or cultural upbringing. So as a result, these disciplines, long regarded by the Western world as a source of knowledge and a path of wisdom, are said to give us no truth about reality. at least no truth that could be supported by the evidence and argumentation, which according to scientism means that theology and philosophy offer no truth at all. And so it's, look back at the history of philosophy. Everyone kind of has different interpretations. One says there's such a thing as reality. Another person says there's no such thing as reality. Well, that just seems to be interpretations. There's no winning out. You can't titrate it. You can't scratch test it. You can't scratch and sniff it. And so therefore only the hard science, the biology, the chemistry, the physics, that's what offers you true truth is going there.
Yeah, All right. So he says one of the great ironies of all of this is that scientism, right? And again, we're not talking about science. He's talking about, this notion of scientism. Scientism is not a doctrine of science. Rather, it's a doctrine of philosophy.
Oh, man.
Right?
Again.
So, and in fact, he says, here's another irony. Scientism distorts science. By its very nature, science cannot claim to be the only way to knowledge. And he hopes that one of the results of his book will be to equip us to see and explain to others that scientism is not a scientific view at all. And so in this book, he's going to provide us with reasons why scientism is harming our children, destroying the church, and undermining our ability to get a fair hearing for the gospel. So that's what he's after in this particular book.
And so he finishes the introduction here by saying that his problem is not with science properly practiced. He loves science, right? He's made that abundantly clear. His issue are with scientism. Indeed, he believes that part of his life's calling for God himself is to stand against scientism and warn and equip his fellow believers about what scientism is, to show that it's not only false and irrational, but a grave danger. So he says that the book that you have or are listening to here is his attempt to fulfill that calling. And again, I want to go back, and I know he didn't write the foreword, but that atomizing spray here, if it's so irrational, if it's so false, if it's such a grave danger, this spurting on of perfume and letting it just an essence of Jesus, if you could turn a phrase there, might not be the proper way of combating this or having the mindset to come up against this. If it's so big and so dangerous, then maybe we need to take a more hardline approach there.
Yeah. So I think part of what he's getting, or what the Edgar was getting at, was Edgeler rather, was we have to do and say what we're doing with kind of grace and kindness and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Though you'll recall that Greg Koukl, he suggests we should do it like that as well. But his notion is we're putting rocks, right, stones in people's shoes, and so that's so the atomizer is being sprayed, I guess, in their face to kind of irritate them, right? If you want to use that analogy there,
yeah,
a rock in the shoe is an irritation. And so Koukl is suggesting, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do, and especially if we can't go, completely with the gospel, we don't have time or the opportunity to do that. We want to get people to think about these various ideas, and he thought of it as putting a stone in people's shoes.
Right. So it annoys him a little bit. I'm just saying, maybe instead of a classy gal, we could be kind of a teenager with Axe body spray and just overpower people, maybe just a little bit more, so we're a little bit more on the annoying side.
Yeah.
All right, well, that'll be the kind of run-up into our first chapter. The first chapter offers a nice little introduction on a little bit more on what scientism is, and also examples of where we might see that in the world. Is it a mindset that only Moreland is thinking about here? Or does he have practical examples, which, spoiler alert, yes, he does. So come back again. You still have time to grab the book. But by the time you get into next week, I would say if you're going to follow along with us, that's probably the time that you want to have the book. And of course, all the links will be in the description below or wherever you might find this. YouTube, Spotify, Rumble. I started uploading again on Odyssey because why not? I've got a little bit of extra time. And so that's all there. And of course, if you don't want to watch us, you can always listen to us, which I'm assuming you're consuming us in some way. So tell others about us and start your own book club around this book. So for all of the other books that we've done, you can go to caveofthecross.com and check out all those previously books that we've done before. All right, next time we'll talking about what is exactly scientism and where we see it. So we always say thanks for joining us. See you next time.
See you next time.